All right, hello everybody. My name is Adam, and my major is education.
And I'm Hannah. My major is also education early childhood.
I'm Rebecca, and mine is business management.
My name is Emily Wolf, and my discipline is psychology.
I'm Tim Anderson, and my area is marketing, but I took business perspective.
And we all work together to address the issue of the Syrian refugee crisis. So like an outline of our presentation, we're going to show a short video. We're going to talk about the results from the problem. We're going to give multidisciplinary perspectives, interdisciplinary perspectives, an action plan, what we can do, and then we have like a petition at the end for everybody participating.
So before we kind of dive into the beef of our presentation, it is really important to understand what exactly a refugee is. And in 2001, Russell found that a refugee is people who are pushed across a border by conflict and persecution. So it is also really important to understand what the difference between a refugee and a migrant is, and this was defined in 2016 by Sengupta. And basically, they defined a refugee as a person who is fleeing war or persecution versus a migrant, which is someone who is leaving for any other reason, such as for economic reasons, for personal reason, whatsoever. And the main difference that you will notice between a refugee and between a migrant is the fact that a refugee is fleeing their country versus someone who is leaving by choice. Also, it is really important to understand what the difference between a refugee is and what an asylum seeker is, because there are two words that are used interchangeably and they're very easy to get confused. Basically, a refugee is someone who has successfully received a approval of refugee status, whereas an asylum seeker is a person who still has pending refugee status, and that was quoted from Bostonus in 2014. And the next slide that we will be looking at is a video, and basically this video looks at a refugee family from Syria who specifically was living in Jordan. And you'll notice, as mentioned in the video, they'll say that they just had received refugee status, so they were previously living in the States as asylum seekers.
Good morning. It's Tuesday. Yesterday was World Refugee Day, so I thought I'd share a story of a family I met while I was in Jordan. Mufak, Nada, and their 5 kids. Mufak was trained as a butcher, but he'd become a successful entrepreneur in Syria, but then he had to leave everything behind in 2012 to escape the fighting, and after 4 years in Jordan, where refugees are not legally allowed to work, the family's savings were depleted. But when I met them back in February, they were excited because they were about to be resettled in the United States, specifically Rockford, Illinois. You may have heard it's easy for Syrian refugees to get approved to live in the U.S., but it's just not. There are many, many layers of background checks involving all kinds of investigations, from iris scans to fingerprinting to lots and lots and lots of interviews. In the case of this family, all told, it took more than 2 years, but at last they've been approved. We've never been to the U.S. before, Mufak told me. We're very excited. We can't wait. Nada told me, I hope Americans will welcome us. I hope we do not disappoint you. So a couple weeks ago, Rosianna and I went to Rockford to catch up with the family. Life magazine once said Rockford is as nearly typical of the U.S. as any city can be. You know, it's the kind of place where downtown there's a statue of a white guy holding fireworks and an American flag. It was great to see the family again, and we enjoyed an immense and delicious lunch together, but the dislocation of the move had clearly been difficult. From the language to the weather, from the healthcare system to the grocery store to the appliances, everything was different. Nada explained one profound change to me. In Jordan, she said, if we needed to go to a shop, we would find public transportation. Here we have to have a car or know someone who has a car. She began to cry as she told me she missed her family and was struggling to get used to life so far from them. Her son comforted her and then told me, Mom also cries whenever Messi scores. Everyone in the family is taking English classes. Mufak will soon begin working as a butcher. The kids are in summer school and starting to learn to read and write in English. In short, the situation is complicated and hard and hopeful, like a lot of our lives. But I'd argue that in every way, socially, politically, economically, we are lucky to have this family in our country. To be a refugee is to be politicized. Too often we're told that because of their ethnicity or religion, refugees are threats, that our civilization is fundamentally incompatible with their civilization. But of course that imagines culture as a discrete, unchanging unit, which it isn't, and it also ignores the facts. The fact, for instance, that American soldiers in the Revolutionary War included Yusuf Ben Ali and Prophet Muhammad, and the fact that today more than 3 million Americans are Muslims, from Dave Chappelle to the owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars to my U.S. Congressman Andre Carson. Nada told me she hopes not to disappoint us. Well, I in turn hope we do not disappoint her. When I asked one of Nada's nephews, who's been in the U.S. for almost a year, what he liked most about his new home, he said, the law. At first, the translator and I were both confused. We thought he was saying the Arabic word for God, but he was saying the law, which had not existed in Syria and which had prevented him from working in Jordan, was what he liked most about the United States. His family did not come here to change the law. They came to be protected by it. Hank, last week UNHCR launched a global campaign called With Refugees, asking people to stand with refugees by signing a petition calling on governments around the world to 1. Ensure every refugee child gets an education, 2. Ensure every refugee family has somewhere safe to live, and 3. Ensure every refugee can work or learn new skills to make a positive contribution to their community. I hope you'll join me in signing that petition. There's a link in the doobly-doo below. And just one last thing, that statue in downtown Rockford of the white guy with the flag and the fireworks, his name is Joe Marino. His parents immigrated to the United States from Italy in a time when many Americans believed that Italian Catholics, with their loyalty to the Pope, could never be real Americans participating in a democracy. And now Joe Marino is a symbol of Americanness to the people of Rockford. We contain multitudes, which has always strengthened us. Hank, I'll see you on Friday.
Alright, so we think that was a really good video that really enlightened us to a different perspective on a family of a refugee. And so I guess I'll open this up to the class. What kind of things watching this video stood out to you or maybe surprised you in their portrayal of this family?
Like the background process, like the checks, the interviews, the Irish things, all that.
Yeah, there's a lot more that goes into admitting refugees and letting them become a part of our society than a lot of times it's portrayed in media.
I think what surprised me the most was that the family was afraid of disappointing us, and I didn't really know that side of it, that emotional side of migrating.
Yeah, I agree. I never really would have thought that from their perspective. We thought, oh, we're having to welcome them, we have to appease them, but really they're doing just as much to try to become a part of this country since they weren't welcomed in their own country, I guess you could say. And so that was really looking at it on a personal level, and so we want to look at more of a macro level of how refugees, although individual families like that may be very open to becoming a part of our culture and being a part of our society, we think it's important to look at it at the macro level and how it is something that can impact our economic and overall diversity. And so the first thing you see there is that 1 in 10 immigrants are refugees, and so even though this doesn't seem like a huge number, that's a lot of people who are coming here not because of their own choice, not because they're seeking necessarily America, but because they're being forced out of their own homeland. So over the periods of 1975 to 2012, there were over 3 million, and then you can see from this that there have been a few 100,000 just in the last few years. And then another huge thing is that there's increasing diversity. And so America's always talked about how we're the melting pot, we're welcoming of all these different diversities. But a really huge challenge is that there are 11 different nationalities represented, as opposed to 64 now. And then the other one, just in a period of less than 10 years, added another, 50 languages, or 40 languages to the already growing diversity within our country. And so I think that taking these things into account along with the different religions, the different backgrounds, makes a really difficult situation, but also a really great opportunity for us to absorb different cultures. And so we'll talk about more of that in our presentation.
So as you can see by the numbers, there are a lot of different people here in the United States now as a result of the refugee crises, which has in turn led to different problems that are faced by these people. For the first of the problems is found by Haas in 2016. What they found is that these refugees who are coming here are actually 2 years behind in education, which is a huge problem when they're trying to normalize their lives and come in and be a part of the American system, and their children are so far behind. Also, refugees who are coming to this country are having a lower mental health than the average American, which is a result of trauma. Also, refugees have a really hard time finding work based on their status because they're not technically seen as American citizens, which makes it really hard for them to find jobs. And finally, refugees are living in dumps and they have little to no education. So moving into my specific discipline, I focused on the area of psychology. And first and foremost, when looking at refugees, we can see that they experience a diverse amount of stressors which are actually unique to this population in and of itself. Refugees are oftentimes compared to migrants, but what is unique about them in comparison to migrants, as touched on earlier, is that they are fleeing their home countries as opposed to coming here by choice. If you add to that the work done by DSCN 2013, we see that oftentimes these refugees are facing dehumanization, and they're coming to this country with these hopes, with these dreams, with these aspirations, and they're almost automatically being shut down by all these different barriers that they really have to try and overcome. And when you add those two problems together, so you're adding the stress together, you're adding the fact that they aren't being treated as regular humans should be, that really leads to a lot of psychiatric problems for them. And in '94, Brewer and Prieb found that refugees face a higher prevalence of psychiatric disorders in relation to the general population. In order to support that work done by Porter and Haslam in 2005 looked at a life events model, and basically what this model found was that psychopathy is a post-traumatic reaction for the stress that war creates. So basically what their model says is because they are in these war-stricken zones, it increases the likelihood that they are to develop mental illness. And it is really important when speaking about mental illnesses to kind of look past the barrier that you're born with a mental illness, because oftentimes you see someone with Down syndrome and they were born with that. Well, it's not just genetics specifically, it is also outside stressors. It's the environment that really play a key role in the development of mental illnesses. And Jeffy and Baulu and all in 2016 found that one of the most prevalent psychiatric disorders that these people face is post-traumatic stress disorder. And to build off of their work in '94, Brewer and Prieb also found that these refugees also face a lot of anxiety and depression. So with that kept in mind, it's really important to realize that refugees often do not actually seek help for their from mental professionals, and this may be due to cultural differences, this may be due to the language barrier, but these people really are in need of help, but they're not seeking it, as found in '94 by Bauer and Prieb.
So now to relate this to education, refugee students, especially school-age ones coming in, they face a lot of problems. So refugee students, they don't have nearly as much formal education as students in the US do. So because of this, they're at least 2 years behind American students. So that causes them to become very behind. They already come in behind, but then with the language barrier, they fall even farther behind, which causes a really big imbalance in the classroom with your students that are already speaking English, they're already ahead of the game. And so it's not only a challenge for the teacher, but it's a huge challenge for that refugee student. And when that student can't catch up with their fellow American classmates, they feel left behind, and when that happens, they become very discouraged, and they usually tend to shut down and then give up. So because they feel like they're that far behind, and they will never be able to catch up, they really don't bother trying after they've given up, which leads to more developmental and educational delays. They also suffer a lot of trauma when fleeing the country and coming into the US. So in their very short lives, they experience more trauma than any of their fellow classmates. So focusing and developing and learning is very hard for them because their mind is obviously on other things. They're not focusing on their schoolwork, they're focusing on everything that has just happened to them in their short life. Their living conditions are also a big factor in their education. When they come into this new country, their families and them, they don't really have much to live off of. They don't really live in the best neighborhoods, the best living conditions. So with these rough conditions, the students are more focused on, when am I going to have dinner next? Am I cold at night? I'm not going to do my homework if I'm freezing and I want to be bundled up in a blanket the whole night. And then also access to healthcare affects their education a lot. Because they usually don't come in with health insurance or money to have access to healthcare, the students tend to, when they do get sick, they tend to stay sicker longer, or they just don't go to the doctor. So then it just progressively becomes worse and worse. So when they are in the classroom, they're not focusing on their schoolwork, they're focusing on they don't feel good, or they just don't come to school, which puts them even farther behind than their classmates. So when this happens, they miss all their assignments, they miss their lessons, they're super far behind. And then also they're super vulnerable to bullying and victimization because of their nationality, their race, their religion, their different cultural norms, and all the stereotypes that follow those. Some students do fight back, which can lead to suspensions and things like that. But many students don't tell anyone, and when that happens, they internalize it, and then that leads to depression or self-punishment, things like that, which leads to less focus in class as well.
So me and Hannah are both in education, so I try to look at it a different view, maybe like a special education view, which is my major. I found an interesting fact. The United Nations Refugee Agency said that 3.7 million school-aged children have no school to go to, which is a pretty sad statistic, and the ones that are in the schools are not receiving much help either. So I came up with like 5 criteria, and one is the students become labeled. They often fall behind due to like many factors like language. Language is a big one. Home life, like and cultural differences. They become labeled as at-risk students, which is often unfair and not needed, but the teachers just do not have time to deal with the language barrier. They may be pushed to the back of the priority list, which is not intentional. It just, like in the life of a teacher, everything has to be done so quick that you often don't have time to pull a student aside. And an IEP may be assigned even though it's not needed. It's just an easy way to get the student what it needs. There's often language barriers as well. Like the students receive multiple language instruction. So like if they're in one country, they see the language of that country, then they move to that one, different, and then when they come here, they are really behind on English, and that often causes a confusion. And then the fact that in schools nowadays we don't really teach it that often, limited opportunities to master the concepts. So another one with language is a poor language instruction. Like English instruction in other countries is often put on the back burner for their home language, and it sets the child behind due to not having opportunities to use it in their home country. Teachers don't often have the time to catch a student up when they move here, unless they're in the younger grades at the beginning of the year when they're first teaching it. And then the teachers have to often teach life skills instead of like academics, because they have to teach students how to act when they come here, because it could be different. The traditions, the classroom expectations, the routines, and like how to act in school is different here than there. And the other students are a big deal, like when you're looking at refugee students. Bullying can be a big problem because of the differences, and this causes self-consciousness in the students. It often causes fear, so they may not want to come to school. And then it's uncertainty about their future. They don't know what's going to happen because it's a completely different world to them.
All right, so we heard about it from the psychology perspective, hearing how mental illnesses and other kind of things that are traumatic can put someone back. And then following that, we talk about education. And I think that those go hand in hand, is that if someone's not mentally sharp and where they are mentally, then it's going to contribute to being less able to thrive in the classroom. And so I think that those two things eventually end up in this business and economic section that I'm going to talk about. So the first statistic I put up there is employment. And so this is that 67% of refugee men, as opposed to only 62% of native-born men, are actually employed. And that's within, I think that's within or just after they have come to the United States. And I think that's a really interesting statistic, because a lot of times we assume that they are not able to find jobs and not able to be employed and provide for their families, which it's hard to look at that statistic without knowing what percentage of those other 33% are really looking for jobs. A lot of them could be, as opposed to the men who are native-born aren't needed to look for jobs. And then it's interesting that both women born in the United States and also born somewhere else who are now refugees have the exact same percentage. And I think those are just interesting to look at, because a lot of people assume, based on media portrayals and other things like that, that when refugees come to America, they're not contributing to society, that they're taking jobs that Americans want. And that's not necessarily the case if you look at the statistics, because those were jobs that Americans had the opportunity to go for. So the next one is income growth. And something that's really interesting is that over time, they really do become acclimated to society. As they are refugees, they're in a position where they need to provide for their families. When you're an immigrant, you can come here, and if it doesn't work out, a lot of times they have the opportunity to move back. But a refugee doesn't have that opportunity in any situation. And so just look two different statistics, and this is after a lot of work was done. In 2009, $31,000 higher medium after they were in the country for 20 years or more. So that means, opposed to when they first come in, that means they're almost getting a $1,000 to $2,000 increase on average every single year of time that they spend in the United States, which I think is really incredible. And then in 2000, there was no income gap between those, which means over the course of those 9 years, a lot was done by these different cities, which one of the things that we're going to propose is how to help more of these refugees become employed right away. But you can see that over the 20-year period, they really are given the education, given the tools, and other things to become employed and make more money. All right, so public programs is something that is very interesting, and also another thing that I keep referencing, the media portrays that refugees could be bad, could be good for our society, and a lot of these numbers point to how they are not utilizing those resources more than native-born Americans, and in a lot of cases, they're actually using them less, and they are becoming self-sustainable. So you see from the first statistic is food stamps. In the first 5 years, 42% are using that, and you can't be shocked by that number because a lot of them don't have the opportunity to get jobs. They don't speak very good English. They have other things like that holding them back from being able to provide for their families in that way, and so we're able to help them with the food stamps. But then after 20 years, only 16% are using them. So that is a huge number that's changed that shows that those who are staying in America are doing what they can to provide for themselves. Welfare participation also dropped dramatically. You can see that from 7 to 2%. And then public health insurance, which is something that we referenced before, where almost a quarter are using it originally to only 13% down the line. And so a lot of those, you wish more of them had access to that health care, but of those who are using it, eventually they are no longer needing to use it. And that information came from a study by Capstone. All right, so the overall things that I want you to take away from this is that compared to, I wanted you to think about what we talked about, how there's migrants and there's refugees, and how they're not exactly in the same situation because one group was coming there for, in this situation, economic immigrants. They're coming here seeking the American dream, seeking another job, seeking a way to provide for their families more than they could in their home country. And so the difference between these are pretty obvious. They have greater English proficiency. If they're coming to America, they're seeking it out on their own. They're not being told by the persecution, by the war that's going on in their country, that they need to leave, but they're often getting prepared beforehand. The next thing is they have more relevant job skills. They're coming here seeking a job, and so often they have prepared themselves to set up to do that. And then they also get higher wages. And so I think that the programs that we are seeking to implement would help to start this process earlier, right when they arrive in America. And then it shows that refugees seek the opportunities to work and contribute. A statistic that I saw that I should have included showed that after, I think it was a 20-year period, 64% of refugees were becoming American citizens, as to less than, I think, 35% for economic immigrants. So it shows that they want to contribute to society, which is different than a lot of times people assume about refugees.
So in bringing all of our disciplines together and specifically looking at it with the psychology lens, we can see that mental illness in refugee children is way higher than their classmates, and therefore that leads to a lot of them really being hurt in their education, as has been touched on by both Hannah and Adam. Moving on, when looking at it with kind of a more marketing and business effect, you can see that the dehumanization of refugees added to the media portraying them with a large in-group, out-group kind of divide, that oftentimes leads refugees to being left out when looking at targeted market groups, which was found by ESSE in 2013. And finally, a lot of the trauma that is faced by these refugees leads to mental illness, as I have said time and time again, and therefore it can sometimes be seen as a negative in the eye of the business world.
And then to look at it from an interdisciplinary approach from the education view, as we've heard, all of these things are very closely connected. They all kind of are like a domino effect on each other. So the first thing, that the language barriers affect their learning, and when they can't learn, or when they can't understand anything, they're not going to learn. They can't comprehend anything, and they get frustrated. And when they get frustrated, they want to ask for help, but that language barrier stops them from asking for help. And then Frustration in school directly affects their work ethic. So when they can't understand, like I discussed earlier, they give up. And so this affects their psychology directly as well, because the frustration can lead to depression, self-punishment. They kind of sink down. They don't want to try. And then also with the psychology, bullying and victimization affects it as well, because that also leads to depression, which leads to a lack of focus in the classroom as well, or maybe a fear of coming to school, something like that. And